Hi, and welcome to the second lecture of Old English. This is the video on Old English sounds. We're going to dive right in with the phonetics and spelling of Old English. Now, the first thing for us to note with respect to Old English as compared to, say, modern English is that there were two different kinds of vowels in Old English. Vowels could either be distinguished as long and short, and modern English has lost that distinction. So you had a difference between good and God, right? I mean, right now we have it as two different vowels, but at that point you would just write it as the O, but with this symbol on top suggesting that it's a long vowel, good versus God, right, which is the short vowel. Now, here is all the vowels that could be used as long vowels and short vowels in Old English. You have a, e, o, u, e. And then all the long vowels, a, e, o, u, e, right? So as you can see, since we were on E, the Old English pronunciation of mice was mees, right? Mees. And the shift from E to I happened later when we look at the Great English vowel shift, which we will look at towards the end of Middle English, beginning of early modern English. So a lot of pronunciations were very different in Old English. So mouse was moose, right? Ride was redone, right? Feed was feedon, etc. Right? So a lot of these kind of vowels, again, you have to look at it phonetically rather than read it out according to the spelling. So that's something for you to keep in mind, not just for Old English, but throughout the rest of the semester, that we are interested in the phonetic sounds and not in the spelling per se. These are all the consonants that Old English had. Old English had B. The sound C depended on what sound actually followed it and preceded it. So it was pronounced as K in consonant clusters, right, such as the word to know. And when it was next to a back vowel, it was pronounced as in camp, so K again. And when it was in front of a front vowel, it was pronounced as ch, as in child. So b, k, or ch, d, f, g, h, k, l, m, n, p, r, s, t, z, w, x, and z, right? These are all the consonants that Old English had. Now, remember that Old English is the closest to Germanic compared to Middle English and early modern English. So one of the things that happened in Old English quite regularly because of its Germanic connection was a phonological process called as mutation. Now, mutation I've defined mutation for you. It's a change in vowel sound caused by a sound in the following syllable. And there were two kinds of mutation depending on Germanic. One is the I mutation and the other is the I umlaut. Now, I mutation, right, is basically, I've given you an example here. The word for bugs, right, bake, from Proto-Indo-European, became bow, right? Bochi, because the following I brought about palatalization of the original K and the vowel mutated. So there were two different things that were happening. So as you can see, first, you had the palatalization, right? So this became palatalized. So you had here, this is palatalization, or you can write that as here, right? And then because of the palatalization, the C was pronounced as a K, right? And this brought about a vowel mutation, and therefore this vowel mutated into this. And all these phonological processes are brought about by the I at the end, right? This I right at the end, right? So So now this is the root form. Whenever you see this this symbol, right, the star symbol, it means it's a root form. So now in Old English, the pronunciation was like this: beach, 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 right? So here you see the ch, because obviously because of this, because of the rule, right? Next to a front vowel, you pronounce it as ch, right? So obviously, if you just go by the spelling, you're not going to be able to understand how to pronounce this particular word. So you have to keep in mind that there were phonological and phonetic processes, but also the fact that spelling has never been reflective of phonological changes in English. The pronunciation of the sound g, the velar stop, the velar voice stop, also depended on the following or preceding sound. So it was pronounced as g before consonants, such as glad or gracious, and was also pronounced as g initially before back vowels like galan, to sing. And it was pronounced as g initially before front vowels. It resulted from a mutation of back vowels. So again, with the word for geese, for example, the Proto-Indo-European is given right here. And then this E caused the I mutation, and therefore this vowel changed into this vowel, and you get geese. So now, okay, so I'm giving you an insight into why we have irregular plurals. Irregular plurals are things like this. Oh my God, I really cannot write with it. Maybe I'll put it like, oh, let me see if I was trying to find if there's a way of adding a sticky note. No, there isn't. So this should read as irregular plurals. I apologize for my bad handwriting. What are irregular plurals in English? So you have goose, geese. That's an irregular plural. A regular plural would be when you take a word book and add a marker to it. So books becomes a regular plural. Now, why is there this vowel change in an irregular plural in English? It's because of the I mutation. So that is a phonological change that resulted because of the E mutation in Old English. And in front of A and E, it was pronounced as the semi-vowel like that. And in all other cases, so these are all the exception cases for the pronunciation of G. In all other cases, it was pronounced as the voiced velar fricative. It's written like this. So dragan, dragan, right? The voiced velar fricative, sorgi, sorgin, g. And this sound later became the w in Middle English. So I know there's a lot that are packed into this one slide, but the main thing for you to remember is that a lot of words, a lot of sounds were pronounced differently according to the phonology and the phonetics of it, right? That's really the crucial point that I'm trying to drive home. And a lot of those kind of quirks in pronunciation has kind of been retained in modern English, in the English that we speak today, but nobody ever gives us an explanation because, hey, we're not really being taught Old English in schools. So the sound ng was actually not a separate phoneme in Old English. And again, I hope you're still familiar with things like phoneme and allophones, because again, like I said, 317 really builds on concepts and terminology that we have looked at in 315. So if anything is unclear to you, you're very welcome to ask me, or you're also welcome to review your notes from 315, in this case, the lecture on phonology. So the sound ng, the velar ng, was not a phoneme, but it was just an allophone of n. So here are cases. So if you remember a lab section, it just came to my mind that we actually did a problem on this in a lab section in 315, where there was data from Old English in your textbook, in the textbook at the back, like in the exercise section, and we did one of these questions as a lab section. So you had things like bringen, right, where you would pronounce it as brink, or ring, right, for ring. And so you can see that this this transition to ng, the sound, kind of happened quite later on. Pronunciation of fricatives. In Old English, the sounds b, z, and z were not phonemes. They were actually allophones. So the environment in which they would occur is only between two voiced sounds, right? So if it was in between, say, b and d, right? Two voiced sounds or something like that. So f, s, and the indicated both the first s, the, and the voiced fricatives b, s, z. So these were the base sounds, and depending on the environment, they would either be pronounced like this or they would be voiced fricatives. The initial H was pronounced as in modern English, h, but elsewhere it was pronounced as a velar fricative from Germanic or the palatal fricative, right, like that. So again, the pronunciation of the h sound really depended on the environment, on the phonological environment. Here was an example of handwriting, or the Roman alphabet, but also remember that the first writing system that Old English used was from insular hand, from the Irish missionaries. And I want you to try to read this to kind of see if you can understand what's going on. So I invite you to pause the video and read this, and then I'm going to give you a translation of it in the next slide. So here is the translation of that. And as you can see, there's actually very few words that you probably would have understood between the last slide and this slide. And the reason is because Old English looks a lot more Germanic than modern English. So Old English, especially, the Old English spoken in like 780 is closer to Germanic than it is to modern English that is spoken in, say, 2021, right? So here's a translation. You're again welcome to pause it and kind of go back and forth to go through the translation. Now, let's look at the stress patterns in Old English. Polysyllabic words, so words that have more than one syllable, had stress on their first syllable. So if you had a word like beautiful, the stress would be on the first syllable, b, right? Bu, bu, b. There were exceptions to this rule, as is the case with English. English always has exceptions, and Old English is no different. Now, exceptions to this rule were when you had verbs with prefixes, such as redo, right? Do is the verb, and then re is a prefix, so redo, right? These were stressed on the first syllable of the main element. So in redo, redo is not a great example, but I'm just trying to show you that re is a prefix attaching to do. The stress will be on the main element, that is the main verb in Old English. Thus, the vowels in the final syllables started to be reduced to the schwa. And if you need a reminder of what the schwa is, the schwa is this symbol, right, in your IPA chart. A friend of yours in this class had requested that I put up the IPA, and I have made that available in last week's activities. If you scroll all the way down, you should be able to get the IPA from 315, a copy of that. So please make sure that you have that, because obviously it will be great to refer back to the IPA chart. So this is your schwa. The vowels in the final syllables of these verbs started getting reduced to the schwa. And that's going to be relevant in a minute. Like, I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. There are also two main ways in which the vocabulary of Old English differed. One was that there were relatively few loanwords, because obviously majority of the words came from Germanic and very few other languages had come into England at that time. The second difference was that gender of the nouns were completely arbitrary. So whether a chair was masculine or feminine or neutral was completely arbitrary, and whether book was masculine or feminine or neutral was again completely arbitrary. The gender of nouns was completely arbitrary. Like I said, many of the words were of Germanic descent, but there was also some influence from Scandinavian because obviously from the Viking conquest, the first one and the second one. And the Old English vocabulary was actually a mix of both Germanic and Scandinavian words. Some words have retained meaning in modern English, but others have changed. And I've given you examples here. So here are some more meanings and words that have survived in modern English, such as the word in bridegroom for man, such as guma, right, which still remains like groom, as in bridegroom. But others, such as to shine, good, etc., the words have completely changed its form. And Old English compounds are also replaced quite often in modern English. So here is an Old English compound for folk right or common law, which again has been replaced with a borrowing from another language in modern English. Old English had grammatical gender, which is completely lost in modern English, but German and Icelandic are two languages that still have grammatical gender. So there were three different genders that nouns were divided into: the masculine gender, feminine gender, as well as neuter gender. So here are examples of grammatical gender. Wife, or the term for wife in Old English was actually neuter gender. Right. So again, it was different from natural gender, which was actually sex-based. So grammatical gender is completely arbitrary, for example. So wife was neuter gender. There was no connotation of being female, right, for wife. And joy was masculine. Very often when we think of joy, for example, we think of joy as being feminine in modern English. So this wasn't the case in Old English. Let's get into grammar now. Now, Old English is very different from modern English in that there's a lot of inflections and declensions that Old English would use. So nouns, pronouns, and adjectives had four different case markings: nominative case, accusative case, genitive, and dative. Now, if you're still unfamiliar with cases, I highly recommend rewatching my Indo-European lecture video where I talk about these different case markings in English. And make notes as you go, right? Because keeping notes is going to be really helpful, especially when we get into midterm. Your midterm is open book and it's a completely online test. But obviously, it's not easy to go back to a video of mine and find the answers. So having these kind of lecture, like small flashcards and keeping all these important points would really be useful. Adjectives in interrogative and demonstrative pronouns had a fifth case instrumental. So let's look at what are interrogative and demonstrative pronouns. Things like this and that are demonstrative pronouns, and interrogatives are things like who, what, where, etc. They also had a fifth case called the instrumental case. And adjectives were not just bare like they are in modern English. They were inflected for definiteness. So you would know from the adjective whether something was a definite noun or an indefinite noun. A definite noun is something like the book in modern English. And an indefinite noun is something like a book in modern English. So adjectives had definiteness, they had a definiteness marker, but they also had gender, number, and case. And these kind of inflections were tied to definiteness. So they had weak declensions and strong declensions in nouns. If you had a weak declension, the noun was a definite noun, and a strong declension, the noun was an indefinite noun. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. Now, again, we will be practicing these things when we get into the lab section for Old English, but I am not going to be asking you a question to solve like this. What I'm trying to say is that you don't need to memorize any of this because your midterm is completely online and it's open book. So you have access to your textbook, and a lot of this is in your textbook. So you just need to be familiar with how to read tables and how to understand all these different, kind of terminology, but you don't need to memorize any of this, right? Just putting it out there just in case you see this and you're like, what the hell is this? So here is an example of an Old English noun. This is the word hound, and it's a masculine noun, and there is a singular as well as a plural form in the different case marking: nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative. And in the plural form, the nominative and accusative is kind of mixed together. So let's kind of walk you through this. Masculine, hound, singular form, plural form, hundas. Hund, nominative, hundas, nominative accusative in plural marking. Hound, masculine accusative, hund, that's the same, hundas in plural. Genitive, hundas, genitive in plural, hunda, dative, hunde, and dative in plural, hundam. Now here's a neuter, a noun, deer, and in nominative it is dior, and in plural it's the same, right? Dior, there's no difference. And genitive is diores, genitive in plural is diora, and dative is diore, and dative in plural is diorum, right? And then there are different kinds of roots, and I'm not going to be walking you through the differences in each of these roots. You can, when you read your textbook, a lot of this is going to be clearer for you with respect to the R stem and the N stem and the O stem. But depending, what is crucial for you to know is that depending on what stem these nouns belong to, their behavior in plural marking and their behavior in case marking is going to be different in modern English. And so a lot of quirks in modern English with respect to irregular plurals comes from these different stems that you actually see in this table. So an R stem is child, an N stem is ox, O stem is love, and the root and consonant stem is foot. And you can kind of go through the paradigms, right? I mean, this looks like a class in Latin, right? Or a class in German, right? But this was how Old English nouns were. Old English had two demonstratives. The most frequent one was that, and then there was also those, right? So that and those. And gender was distinguished only in singular. So you had a distinction for gender only for that, because those is plural. And the modern English definite article, the, was actually a development later on from the masculine nominative form, the. And again, if you look at your textbook, you will see that there are tables looking at all these demonstratives with gender and case marking, etc. So you will see this form, this is a masculine nominative form that kind of later developed into the of modern English. And the modern English demonstrative that developed from the neuter nominative accusative that looks like this, that. Adjectives, like I said, had a lot more morphology in Old English. There was gender, there was case, there was number. And depending on the weak declension and the strong declension, there was also differences in combination. So here is a weak declension, say Dola signing, that foolish king. And this weak declension was used after demonstratives and possessive pronouns. And the strong declension was used when the adjective was not preceded by a demonstrative or a possessive pronoun, so just say. Okay, so this is dole signing, and you can see there's no ah, right? This ah. So this is the weak declension. This signals that, and then no declension or strong declension for when there was no demonstrative or possessive pronoun preceding the adjective. Adverbs in Old English was a derivative of adjectival forms. So this was often created by adding the suffix e, which is the instrumental case ending for with. So you had wroth, which meant angry, and rothe, which meant angrily. So this e kind of signaled the presence of an adverb, or the creation of an adverb. And there were also, this E ending kind of was lost in modern English. So in a lot of cases, we have adjectives and adverbs in modern English that are identical. So it's loud and deep and slow, etc. But we can also use the Y ending in modern English. So drive slow versus he proceeded slowly to kind of show that slowly is an adverb and not an adjective. But that's in modern English. All right, so now we come to pronouns. Pronouns are interesting because pronouns are the only system, the only category of words that have retained its complexity from Old English all the way to modern English. Now, the difference between pronouns is that Pronouns still have case markings. So you can say he ate an apple, right? But when you put that into the accusative form, you have to say the apple was eaten by him. You don't say the apple was eaten by he. And this is because him is an accusative case marking because it's in the object position. When you say the apple was eaten by him, but when you say he ate an apple, he is in the subject position, nominative case marking. So pronouns are the only kind of complicated system that still retains this kind of complexity from Old English. In addition, Old English also had another set of pronouns called the dual. So it had singular pronouns, plural pronouns, but also a dual pronouns. And this entire column of dual pronouns was lost in modern English. So here is the Old English pronoun system: singular, nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. Um, this is a singular and then the plural form. So I, me, my, mine, thou, you, thee, you, and thy, thine. We all, us all, our, ye, you all, and your. And then dual: we both, us both, our, you both, and your. Okay. So this, like I said, the dual gender does not exist in modern English, but it existed in Old English and towards the beginning of Middle English. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about before I talk a little bit about the syntax and other things in Old English is the verbal forms of Old English. And verbs came in the weak form as well as a strong form. So in the weak form of a verb was created by adding the de or the te to form past tense. So talk, talked, right? That was the weak form. And the strong form was created by changing the vowel, by stressing the vowel. And that's why we call that as irregular verbs. So irregular verbs are strong verbs from Old English, and regular verbs are weak verbs from Old English. So talk, talked, sing, sang, and sung, an example of a strong verb from Old English. And here are examples of verbal conjugations. And as you can see in Old English, there were a lot more conjugations compared to modern English and Middle English. So here is an example of a verbal conjugation in the present from the infinitival form: to help, the simple form, and then you have the inflected form, the indicative form for each of the pronouns, for each of the genders, subjunctive, the imperative, and the participle, right? And again, your textbook has all these tables that are really, really kind of easy to read and well structured. So I highly recommend you read that chapter before we get into the lab section next week. Because we will be doing a couple of these examples, and I will, kind of refer you back to the textbook in order for you to do it. So having read the chapter before next week would really be good. And here are verbs in the past tense, in indicative, subjunctive, and the past participle for the verb for the verb to help. Now, when you look at the different kind of modalities for the verbs, so remember the verbs cannot have case endings. Case endings are only for nouns. What verbs have is tense and aspect markers, right? Or what we call as modalities. Indicative forms were the most frequent. So you have indicative, right? I helped, you helped, he or she helped. And here indicative, I help, you help, he or she or it helps. And why are indicative forms the most frequent? Because these are the forms that you use to make statements and ask questions. Followed by imperatives that were used to make commands, right? Do this, right? Or ordering other people to do something, right? And subjunctive was used to express wishes as well as commands. Here are examples of the non-finite forms in Old English. There were 4 different forms, 2 different infinitives, 1 for most verbs, such as strong verbs, and 1 for weak verbs, as well as 2 different participles. They were all as endings, so unending, ian ending, ende, and n. And here are some tables for weak verbs in Old English. Again, there were three main classes of weak verbs in Old English: in the infinitival, in the past tense, as well as the past participle. So class 1, to do, did, and done. Class 2, to end, ended, and ended. And class 3, to have, had, and had. And in strong verbs in Old English, there were actually 7 different classes because of the changes in the vowels. And I'm not, again, the tables are in the textbook, so we will be practicing with them in the lab section next week. And there were also some other verbs, and these were often called as suppletive verbs, such as to be. So you see, I am, but you are, he, she, it is, and me, you, they are. So these are suppletive verbs in Old English, and you can see that this kind of suppletive forms, they remain the same in Middle English as well as early modern and modern English. So to kind of wrap up Old English, just to kind of give you a little brief summary about syntax, there were no articles in Old English. There were no articles such as a, an, the, etc. that developed later on. There were very few auxiliary verbs because there was a lot of complex morpho syntax. They only had 2 tenses, present and preterite or past. And Old English used a simple infinitive and a passive. So she ordered him to teach was in a infinitival form, to teach. And Old English was subject prodrop. So what do I mean by subject prodrop? You could drop the subject of the sentence in, like, he ate an apple. You could drop he because the subject or who the subject was quite understandable from the ending on the verb, because remember that verb has conjugations, right? It has declensions for subject and gender. So you can drop the subject. That's called as prodrop. You're dropping the subject because the information about the subject could be retrieved from another part of the sentence. Subjunctive mood was very common. Some men say that it be a long-haired star. So it be a long-haired star. That's the subjunctive sentence right here. Such kind of constructions were very common in Old English. Sometimes the subject of an Old English verb can be expressed twice in a sentence, once as a pronoun and one as in a phrase, like as in, the main name or a noun phrase. The negative adverb preceded the verb modified, like I did not, right? I did not. So that's the negative adverb preceding the verb. And used parataxis, that is basically arranging clauses side by side without subordination. So if you could have 2 clauses nearby without like conjoining them or without having the that, you can kind of drop the that. So you can say, some men say it be a long-haired star, instead of some men say that it be a long-haired star. And I have 2 videos right here of Old English, and I encourage you to watch these videos. One is kind of, it'll show you how the pronunciation of Old English was very different from modern English and Middle English. And there's another video which was a class that had to do an assignment in Old English. So I highly recommend you to watch these 2 videos as well. And next week we will be doing a lab section. And while we do the lab section, like I said, keep your textbook with you when you do the lab section video. And a lot of these things will be clear to you as and when we practice in the lab section. So I will see you all next week in a new video.